Hi, welcome to Bathtub. It's the old master bather, Scott Bradfield, and the old master bather's parakeet, Dodo the Wonder Parakeet. And you might notice she's back to normal. Which is not always good. Not always good with Dodo, but she's back to normal and looking very healthy, and has got all her feathers back. And we're doing these very quickly. Because I'm trying to get. Basically, I had a lot of time to read in the past few months. I've been enjoying it, but then all this stuff mounts up. So this is a new. This is kind of a new theme show. It's called Vintage Paperback SF Hodgepodge. We have a lot of SF fans out there. Especially when I was young, I read lots of SF, and I still enjoy read. I tend to reread it. I don't really read new stuff. I should probably, but I only mainly read the old stuff I read as a kid, and I really love the old vintage paperbacks. So this past week or two, I read quite a few, and what's really interesting about doing these talks is I go over to my shelf because that's what the purpose of these talks is, to clear off my reading shelf so I can put it back on the bookshelves and take them off the reading stack. And I have 3 books here which I read in over the past week or two. And they're writers who I've often liked over the years. And every time I read one of them, I think, I want to read a few of them. And then I get distracted by another writer. So anyway, this is a hodgepodge. Three really cool old books. And I think just seeing the old books is cool. That's Fritz Leiber. I don't think we've done much on Fritz Leiber. I met Fritz Leiber when I was like 15 at some sort of SFWA party once. He was a huge, tall guy. And he was a really very gentle, soft-spoken guy. But he did look, he was an actor at one point of his life. He was a big, interesting, imposing character. And he was sitting down when I met him. I think he was taller than me when he was sitting down. This is called Shadows with Eyes. It's one of many short story collections that Fritz Leiber wrote in his lifetime. He wrote lots of short stories. He wrote in a lot of genres. So he was he was a friend of Lovecraft. A lot of writers, especially young writers, kind of gravitated to Lovecraft when they were young men. And he was one of the people who wrote him lots of letters when he was young, like C.L. Moore and Henry Kuttner and Charles, the great Charles Ashton Smith, Clark Ashton Smith. Anyway, he wrote a lot of horror novels. I read some of them were brilliant. He wrote 2 of my favorite horror novels, which I want to reread soon. One is called Conjure Wife, which is a great book. I remember I read it when I was 15. I couldn't put it down. And the other one I read at least twice, called Our Lady of Darkness, which is one of the great horror novels, and it's set in San Francisco, a city I knew sort of well. I was raised up in, and it's incredible. I read it twice, and it was just a terrific read. So I want to get back to those. He's most famous for doing the sword and sorcery stories about, what do they call, Fafhrd and the Great Fafhrd, I think, is the big guy, and then Grey Mouser is the little guy. And I've read those, and I like them. You have to be in the right mood. They're sword and sorcery type books. And then he wrote lots of science fiction. And he's often blended the 3 genres in kind of interesting ways. His prose is very kind of rich and kind of ornate and kind of interesting. All this stuff is interesting. And you never quite know where a Fritz Leiber story is going to go. He wrote lots of short stories in his life. Anytime I pick up a collection, I like to do the single author collection. He's worth picking up. There's a best of Fritz Leiber from Valentine Books from the 60s. We love that series. And that's a very good author-selected book, fairly large. And he also did lots of these just for money. He would publish different editions of short stories. I think there's only six tales of crawling horror. I mean, just look at the Valentine Books, man. Look at that. They don't make books as beautiful anymore. Look at that. I'm telling you. And then they had pictures of the other books that were coming out. This is a really old one. This would have been, I bought this 1962. So this is even when I was, I was buying old books when I was a young kid when I got this. Anyway, this is 6 short stories. I'd read some of them before in different editions. And God, I read it last week. I've already sort of forgotten a lot of these stories. Oh, so they're really good, though. I really enjoyed it a lot. One of his most famous stories in here is The Man Who Made Friends with Electricity. That's a famous story of his about a guy who actually learns to talk to electricity. It's kind of a horror, kind of science fiction story. The first story is called A Bit of the Dark World. And again, it's been a couple weeks now. I forget things so quickly. It's very Lovecraftian, about going to some house out in the country, which is on the edge of some precipice with the other world or something. And the stories, even when they sound a little crazy, they sound a little common. He really draws you into these stories. And they're very, very good. Very wonderful, wonderful short story writer. The Dead Man's a brilliant story. That's the one I remember most vividly, which is about a doctor who works with a man who can simulate diseases. So he can hypnotize the guy and say, you have bone cancer. And this man will literally embody the illness and all the symptoms of that disease. And then he can snap him out of it. And at one point he says, why don't you pretend you're dead? It's a great setup, and it's a really good story. Each of the stories is very different. I can't remember the power. I really, really like The Power of the Puppets and Schizo Jimmy, and I completely forget what the stories are about. That's where I got to get to these things more quickly. The final story is called A Desk Full of Girls, and that's also an interesting one, which is about a psychiatrist who treats young women, and he somehow can excise problems that these women have, and he puts them in folders. And they're kind of these ghost emanations of these women. Each of the stories is very different, very interesting, very absorbing, very haunting. You can't really read when you have a good collection like that, more than one story at a time, but that was a very good one. Here's one, again, I read this a couple of weeks ago too, and I've almost completely forgotten it, but I liked it. The Last Starship from Earth. See, I can't read new SF because I haven't read all the stuff I bought when I was a kid. I bought this because John Boyd, because the Berkeley covers had these wonderful, I think I want to say Paul Lair was the artist. He did all these big, giant, weird pictures. And Berkeley used him a lot. And God, that's a cool cover. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever, but it's just a cool cover. And he's an English writer. And it's sort of a futuristic, it's a kind of dystopian novel where in the future, mathematicians have taken over the world. And they basically have turned all of society into mathematical formulas. For example, they get rid of the Pope because he's a human being, and they create a robot Pope. What's that? It's not a bad idea, I guess. I guess it doesn't matter which one it is, but there's a robot Pope, and he runs everything. And people aren't allowed to be in love, so there's that notion that love, and you get that in 1984, that passion and sexual passion are the one thing this society can't control. So that's the story. Then there's kind of a weird, in the whole middle of the book, this book got a lot of good coverage when it came out. It was very well reviewed. I remember seeing reviews of it when I was a kid, 1968, and I always wanted to read it. And it was definitely worth reading. I found the middle parts, there's a long court case where they're going to teach, this guy's got to be punished for having fallen in love with somebody. And that because it goes on a little too long. And then the rest of the book was kind of fun. I enjoyed it. Finally, my favorite book to reread is, and we talked a bit about him with Robert Sheckley a few weeks ago, the great C.M. Cyrus, is it Cyril Kornbluth? I don't remember. Cyril Kornbluth, I think, and Frederick Pohl. In the 50s, they were roommates and buddies, and they were very young men. And I like Frederick Pohl's stuff. I'm not a huge fan of most of his stuff. I like some of his books. But the books he did with Kornbluth are easily his best books. This is called The Space Merchants. You may have heard about it. It's from the 50s. It was originally published as Gravy Planet. It's a satire on the advertising business. One of the things I found is a lot of writers in New York worked in advertising. Because they wrote jingles, and Tom Dish worked for the advertising for a while. A lot of these writers, I think Sheckley worked in the advertising business. And Kornbluth was a real weird character. He died too young, and he was like Sheckley, just kind of a brilliant craftsman. He could really write wonderful scenes and stories. This book, the first 100 pages, it just zips along. So many things happen so quickly and so sensibly. But basically, the central character is an advertising man who's trying to sell everybody. He's been commissioned by his company to make people want to go to Venus, which is this horrible planet where everybody just like boils to death, but it's going to be a horrible place to go. But they want everyone to go there because they need to release the population of the country is a mess, and they need to get rid of all these people. So he's got to advertise and create jingles or send all these idiots to Venus. And in the course of the story, one of the things that I think Kornbluth does is a couple of times, his character is like working for the company. He's totally loves the companies. He hates there's something called the consies. I think they're consies. They're like conservationists. They want to save the planet instead of burn it all up like we do today, making money out of it. and he somehow gets thrown off, and he gets sent to a prison world, and he has to get out by being friends with these consies, these conservationists, and he hates them. He thinks they're all a bunch of tree huggers, like they call them now. They're tree huggers. The story moves along so quickly, so beautifully. It's a wonderfully plotted story, and then it's very funny along the way. I found the last 15, 20 pages, that I often do with a lot of genre fiction, there's a little bit of too much of a tying bows around all the endings, and it didn't quite work for me. And I think they actually cut some of the original edition of this was called Gravy Planet and Galaxy. It still holds up. I'd say the first 130 pages, 150-page novel just is kind of a beautiful piece of narrative writing, and very funny, very quick. And Cornbluth really deserves to be remembered when we can. He wrote some wonderful stuff, including his masterpiece, the greatest title about a modern American life, The Marching Morons. The Marching Morons is a great story. This has a lot of emanations that sound like The Marching Morons. Okay, stay safe. 3 terrific, beautiful old books. This is the edition I used to have. I was going to bring the other ones out. There's the old Ballantine. These were all reprints. I had passages I wanted to read to you, but there's just too much good. There's too many good passages to pick one, and I don't want these to go too long. Happy bathing. All these are lovely books, even if you don't read them. They're lovely to look at. Take care.